tonight I'm going to be giving the third talk on our new theme, Building on Emptiness. Ooh, very mysterious title. And I want to start off with an image of building on emptiness. And the image is of a blue sky. So the blue sky is surrounding us, it's infinite in all directions, above, below, and in every direction. And we discover that not only is the world around us completely made of blue sky, but we ourselves are made of blue sky. And as we sit in the blue sky, we watch as out of the blue sky, a Buddha emerges, a Buddha figure emerges, sitting on a lotus, completely made of light, manifesting all the beauty and all the myriad qualities of enlightenment. And that image is a very traditional Buddhist image, and one which I and many other order members will be meditating on most days when they meditate. So the blue sky and the Buddha figure emerging out of the blue sky. And that's an image of this title, which is Building on Emptiness, which is our theme. And I love this title because it is so mysterious. What is it to build on emptiness? What is emptiness? So as we've heard, emptiness doesn't mean that there's nothing at all. What are we empty of? Well, we're empty of a fixed and unchanging self. We're empty of that. We're empty of anything which is fixed and rigid. And everything is empty of that. There's nothing in conditioned existence whose nature is not to change and flow and be in flux all the time. Nothing can be fixed. Nothing can be pinned down. And the blue sky is the traditional image for that, which is shunya, emptiness, or shunyata. And but because we're empty, because we're not fixed, what that means is that we've got infinite potential. Everything has this infinite potential. Out of the blue sky can emerge the Buddha figure. And in a way, the Buddha figure can only emerge because there is the blue sky. We're nothing but emptiness. So we can build that beauty in ourselves. That Buddha can emerge from the emptiness of our existence. And as we transform ourselves to become that more Buddha-like, we begin to transform the world around us, because we don't exist in isolation from the world. If we transform ourselves, we necessarily transform the world into being a more beautiful place. And when we're doing that together with the Sangha, when we're doing that together, we begin to build a world around us where things are just more beautiful and more full of joy and truth. And the word given to this sort of world that we can build in that way is a Buddha land or a Buddha field, so called because it's permeated and perfumed by the influence of the Buddha and his Dharma, the teachings. And so the important thing here is that to build this Buddha land, we have to start with ourselves. We have to be building it from the bottom up. It doesn't come into existence separate from us. In a way, we are the bricks of that Buddha field, of that Buddha land. So if we want to build that Buddha land, we need to transform ourselves into a brick, into that sort of brick. So that's what this whole theme is about, how we become bricks. And how do we do that? That should be the subtitle, actually, I think, for the whole how to be a brick. And how we do that. So last week we heard from Mokshatara that the first step really is to become truly human, in the sense that we don't habitually live in realms of mental states which are so intense that we can't be creative, we can't see the gap. So we're not dominated by neurotic desire or aggressive competitiveness or extreme states of suffering, or being just driven by our animal desires, or being lulled into apathy by just experiencing constant pleasure and well-being with no suffering at all. And those were the realms of the wheel of life that we looked at last week. So the first step then is to become truly human, so that we can become capable of real growth. But then, having reached the human state, further growth is by no means certain. By no means certain. You could say that being human is a necessary but not sufficient condition for growth. Just for anybody who likes having things put in that way. Necessary but not sufficient condition. So we become human, but what sort of human can build the Buddha land? What sort of human can be a brick? So that's what my talk is going to be about today. So the next step that we're going to talk about is becoming not just a human, but an individual human. So my talk is called Suspense. Hopefully you know anyway. It's called Becoming an Individual. It's not that exciting, actually. Becoming an individual. Becoming an individual. So what do I mean by individual? So I'm not using it in just the standard way that individual is used, as in I'm an individual, Bodhinaga's an individual, different people, or have individual rights. So it's being used in a particular way here, and a way which I could say is more the true individual. So I'm talking about being a true individual. And I'll talk more about all the many, many qualities of a true individual a bit later on. But I'm going to start with one of the main qualities of an individual, a true individual, which is the true individual is capable of standing aside from the group, standing alone outside of the group. So I'm going to begin by going into a little bit what we mean by group here and what that might be like. And then hopefully it will become clearer what an individual is, which is not that, basically. So what do I mean by group? So a group is a kind of collection of any collection of people that is united in some way by some sort of tie or some sort of bond. And there's so many different sorts of groups. So one example of a group, say, is a family. So a family is united by ties of blood, a group of people united in that way. Our country is a group united by our social structures, our political structures, our place of birth, and our customs and language. So those are some examples of groups. So some groups we're born into, so like our nationality is a group that we're born into, our gender is a group that we're born into, things like that. Some we choose to become, so we choose to become affiliated to some groups. So I know Bodhinaga's a very keen Liverpool fan. That's a group he's very much chosen to become, although I think you were sort of born into that as well, weren't you? But you've chosen to become affiliated into that group. And any other sports clubs, hobbies, political parties, religious organisations, workplaces, friendships, fashions, and even eating habits. So some people are really defined by what they can eat and what they can't eat, like being vegans and things. So what are groups? I'm a vegan, so don't take that badly. So what are groups like? So that's some examples of groups. What are they like? So groups have particular ways of doing things. They've got particular cultures, particular customs. And they tend to have particular sets of beliefs about what's right and what's wrong. And often the groups are represented by slogans or symbols which still instill inspiration and loyalty into their adherents, their fans. So the example that I'm going to talk about now is a group that I'm very keen on being affiliated with, which is Star Trek. And I do talk about Star Trek a lot in my talk, so apologies, but it's very dharmic. So I want to talk about Star Trek. So I consider myself a Star Trek fan, and there's even a word for us. We are Trekkies. So that is the group. The group is the Trekkie group. And Star Trek has many symbols associated with that. I meant to print it off, actually, but this is the main one, isn't it? Can I even remember how it goes? Something like that, isn't it? It's the communicator symbol. That might be wrong. Anyway. So if you see this symbol on somebody, I know they're one of mine. They're in my gang. They're in my group. Also, if I see somebody wearing a certain T-shirt that says boldly go, I know that because of the poor grammar, they must also be a Trekkie. So they're part of my group. So if I spot somebody like that, I instantly feel a bond, I feel connected with them, they're my sort of person. So that's great, isn't it? Why would that be a bad thing? I also feel safe from attack, so I know that these people aren't going to tell me how rubbish Star Trek is. They're not going to assault my views. They're actually going to tell me that what I think is right, which is great. And it means that we're all kind of fans united against other very inferior science fiction shows. We're on the same side. So we're a team. So in some ways, what I've done is I've kind of lost a sense of my own self or my own identity, and I've become submerged in a sort of bigger culture group. And that might not be so obvious in Star Trek actually, but I have noticed this maybe at football matches or gigs or on rallies and things where you're kind of surrounded by lots of very loud people who all agree with you, and you're all chanting, you're singing along to the music, or you're chanting or you're shouting the same things, and it's a bit like you totally lose a sense of yourself and you become part of this bigger consciousness, a group consciousness, which is actually quite pleasant, I find, to lose a sense of yourself in this way. And, I mean, coming down a bit, I mean, Star Trek is a bit of a flippant example. I mean, my adherence to Star Trek group doesn't really, my life does not depend on it. But actually, historically, adherence to groups, our life has depended on it. And I've been reading about this in preparation for giving the talk, and I've discovered that ever since the beginning of humankind, we've naturally arranged ourselves into groups so that we could, live together because we couldn't survive alone. So being ejected from the group would literally mean death. So it means certain death. And actually, even now, even though being ejected from the group might not mean certain death, there are situations where if people are standing outside the group, they can suffer. They can suffer very badly. I'm thinking of countries like India where certain castes or ex-castes are persecuted or experience prejudice. Certain situations where being out of the family means that you are rejected, you lose any entitlements, you lose any, you lose your rights. And even I was thinking in situations where it's not literal death or persecution, even just being outside of a group for people can lead to a lot of isolation and loneliness, which although it's not a literal death, can be a lot of suffering for people. And Bhante Sangha, who set up this movement, he says that being part of a group is in our bones, it's in our blood. So it's a very kind of deep thing, this need to belong, to be part of a group. So if all of this is true, then what's wrong with groups? I think it sounds quite great being part of a group. So why would we want to be standing apart from a group? Well, the trouble with groups, it's not so much the group itself, as with a lot of things, it's how we choose to respond to the group and our responses to the group. One possible response we can have to a group is we can want to conform to the group, and people who tend towards this we call conformists, people who tend to conform to groups. And we want to be part of it. So I'm a natural conformist. I want to be part of Star Trek. I want to be part of this group and that group. I want to feel like I belong. I want people's approval and praise. That's very, very natural in me. So we move towards taking on the culture of that group very naturally. I want to identify with the beliefs of that group, the behaviour of that group, everything about the group. If you're conforming to a group, you've got a sense of loyalty to that group and the other group members in that group. But the problem with this is that this sort of loyalty and this sort of kind of identification very, very naturally and easily leads into defensiveness or aggression against other groups. So it's not just that Star Trek is great, it's that other shows are inferior. It's not just that our football team is great, it's the other ones are rubbish and we want them to lose. And I remember very clearly so I'm actually a secret southerner and I was born in Luton, and I used to go to Luton Town matches, and Vidania might know this, heckling. So there's a great chant that they chant in the stands, the Luton fans, and it goes like this. We hate Watford, and we hate Watford, we hate Watford, and we hate Watford, we hate Watford, and literally that's it. So we're just completely defined by what we hate, because we're in this group, they're our rivals, and we hate them. So I think that's the nature of groups, really, is we protect our own, and we defend against other groups, and we slander the other groups, and that is the nature of group mentality, sadly. And it leads to this kind of defensiveness and aggression, and it leads to this attitude of polarization, us against them. And what that does really, it exemplifies and deepens our delusion that we're separate, that we're different from people, and actually that by rubbishing somebody who's different from us, that's going to cause us happiness and fulfillment, because we know that that's not true. And it's very, very opposite, actually, of the attitude of metta and the wisdom of interconnectedness that we're trying to cultivate as Buddhists, hopefully. So that's one problem with the group. A second problem with a group is that it's the nature of groups to fear difference. So groups depend on the conformity of the members of the group to the kind of rules and customs of that group. And that's where the power of the group comes from. And because of this, groups won't tolerate difference at all and will expel members who exemplify or express difference. So I was thinking of people who I know who've been thrown out of families or ostracised in social situations because of their gender, their sexuality, people who suffer abuse because they're a bit different because of their disabilities or their class or their background or just how they look, how they dress, their haircut. So it's just the smallest thing can mean that a group will expel a member, then they're not part of us anymore. Yeah. Also, people are expelled from groups because of their views as well. I've been, there's hear about people being expelled from political parties because they express a different view, they don't toe the party line, so they're thrown out of the party. And Socrates, bless him, he was killed because he was preaching philosophy that the state didn't approve of. They thought it was dangerous, so they killed him. So it's a very extreme example of a group really silencing anybody who dares to say something different. So for us, our need to be part of a group to avoid the censure of the group might really restrict us from expressing our true opinions and following what we know and see are more true values. So yeah, our need for approval and our fear of blame of that group will dictate our behaviour to some extent if we're trying to conform to a group. And so in a way, we're sort of at the mercy of the group consciousness. Whatever the group decides, we have to kind of change ourselves to either be more like it or less like it. Even in our friendship groups, we might have noticed this. So I've definitely experienced this. I sort of know that a certain way of thinking about a topic is popular among a group of my friends, and I know I have a different opinion, and I find myself nervous about expressing that opinion because I know that they're going to think of that. I don't know whether they're going to approve. I don't know if they're going to still like me, and whether I'm going to be criticised or rejected by my friends. And as Dharma practitioners, this is a real problem because as we're trying to grow and change, a large majority of our views and ways of behaving will hopefully start to drop away because a lot of them aren't really our own at all. We've just taken them on from the groups and societies that we're part of and the standards that they hold. So if we start to get rid of them, if we start to change our views and our ways of behaving, we're necessarily going to be challenging certain groups that we're parts of. But the groups that we belong to, that exemplifies those beliefs, they're going to resist that and put pressure on us to not change, to stay the same. And you might have already experienced this if you've made any changes since you started practicing the Dharma. I was in a little discussion group a few weeks ago on the Sangha retreat, and we were talking about what it's been like for people trying to move towards being a vegetarian or a vegan, and the difficulty they've had in social situations with people kind of resisting the difference and feeling threatened and criticised by their choice to change their eating habits. And the same could be true if you've decided you don't want to start going out and getting drunk all the time, or you've decided that you don't want to do loads of overtime because you want to have time to meditate. Our groups of our friends and our workplaces and things like that, they're going to resist those changes. It's hard to resist the pressure of the group because we are being a part of the group is such a part of our makeup. So so if we try and conform to these groups, if we let ourselves be driven by the approval of this group, then it will really stunt and limit our ability to grow and change, and really restrict our ability to grow. So that's the second problem. Maybe, oh no, next one. Okay. And finally, I was thinking about this as well, that it's not necessarily a great thing to be surrounded only by people who share our own views. And there's this term echo chamber, which I've heard particularly in relationship with websites and groups on the web recently, where you'll find a group or a site, or maybe a group of friends who you know share the same views as you. And then you go and tell them your view so that then you'll get the same view back from them. They agree with you, yeah, you're right, you're so right. And you know what, another thing. And what happens is you just end up hearing your own view reinforced again and again. But that's not such a great thing, because actually, if we're trying to change and grow, ideally we're going to be becoming less identified and attached to the views that we've got, and less fixed and rigid about always being right than we were before, not more attached to them. So if we're surrounding ourselves just in groups that share our views, there's a danger that we're just going to be getting ourselves shown back to ourselves, and we're going to become more and more fixed selves rather than looser with ourselves. Okay, so obviously conforming to the group isn't great for those reasons. So what do we do then? So is the best thing for us to decide, okay, this group stands for this, so I'm just going to do the opposite. Is that what being an individual is? Is that what we should do? Sadly, no. That would be kind of easy, really. So unfortunately, that's the other unhelpful way that we can respond to a group, and that is called individualism. So in an individualist sort of response to a group, we are disliking being identified by a group. We really don't like to be thought of as being in a group. We like to think that we stand above the group. We're better than the group. We're better than those sheep who all think that same thing, and we tend to feel a bit superior to the group. And we sort of feel compelled to rebel against the group, rebel against what we think are the received opinions of that group, and to take up counter views. I was struggling to find an example of this because I'm such a conformist, so I asked a friend of mine if she could help me, and she told me, this is great, so when she first started going to Buddhist centres, she perceived it as being a bit too holy, and everyone would be, being kind of quiet and polite, so she would deliberately start to swear more than she would normally, in direct rebellion against the kind of holy atmosphere that she was not wanting to conform to. I thought that was a great example. And I know I've done similar, I must have done similar things. I sort of got vague memories of dressing even more outrageously than I would normally, because I know that it will particularly annoy somebody if I dress like that. I might think I'm going to be with a particularly straight bunch of people, so I'm going to dress particularly not straight. So, yeah. So, but this sort of behaviour doesn't mean that we're individuals, because we're still, our behaviour is still determined by the group. It's still determined by the group. We're referencing our own behaviour in opposition to the group rather than trying to conform to it. And in a way, you could say that if I'm a conformist, my happiness depends on the approval of the group. But if I'm an individualist, my happiness depends on the disapproval of the group. Either way, I'm still dependent on the group. My behaviour is still completely at the mercy of the group consciousness. And interestingly, as an aside, I was reflecting that I've been a member of various subcultures over my life that have defined themselves in opposition to the kind of main society. So kind of the gay movement and the climbing community can be a bit like that, underground clubbing scenes, veganism. So I've been part of these kind of groups. And I often notice that these countercultures that define themselves in doing the opposite to what the main culture does, are often far more groupy than the main culture, because they're like, we're like this and they're like that, and they can get even more kind of rigid and aggressive and kind of groupy. So I just thought that was really interesting, possibly because smaller groups like that are trying to feel like they've got to defend themselves against bigger groups. So, okay, so it doesn't seem to work to go along with the group and be a conformist. It doesn't seem to work to go against the group and be an individualist. So what on earth are we to do? So thankfully there is a response, and the response is to be an individual. So that's the option that we're trying to head for as Buddhists. We're trying to become individuals. So an individual's response to the group is basically that it's not determined, the response of an individual is not determined by the group at all. You could say that if we're conforming to or rebelling against a group, we're responding to a group at its own level. But an individual's response is above and over the group. It's not responding to the group on its own level at all. And the behaviour of an individual may go along with the group, or it might go against the group. But the motivation of the individual is not the approval or the disapproval of the group. It's not interested in either the approval or the disapproval of the group at all. So instead, the individual is acting out of motivation of awareness and metta. and not out of psychological dependency on anybody else. So the individual is psychologically independent, which sounds amazing to me. So somebody who's not dependent psychologically on anybody else is therefore free to act completely spontaneously in line with their own values, because they're not going to be influenced by anyone else's values in that particular way. And the individual is also very, very aware of themselves and their own conditioning as well. So they know what groups they're part of, they know what conditioning they've been exposed to, and they're constantly alert to that and trying to overcome that. So not taking on the received opinions of the groups unquestioningly, but examining them and assessing whether they think they're really true for themselves. Even if that means they're able to stand alone in a really positive way. And even if they were the only person in the world who held that view, they would still be happy to hold that view. So they'd be happy to stand completely alone. And I think that's a quality which is really, really attractive, because so often I feel personally pulled and pushed about by the winds of praise and blame and approval and disapproval and status. And imagine being free, completely free of all that, how amazing that would be, just to stand in what you really know to be true without being pulled around. And of course, the ultimate example of this is the Buddha, who firstly left his caste, he left his wealth and his family, left them all on the quest for truth. And along the way, he left lots of groups where he was respected, because he knew that wasn't the answer. And in the end, becoming enlightened, the only person in the world to have that experience, and getting a lot of stick for it, I must say, every now and then, but still his own man. So the true individual then is inhabiting this space of real freedom and equanimity, and not pulled and pushed about by trends and fashions and acceptability. So this sounds attractive to me, and hopefully it sounds attractive to you. So the next question then is, how do we develop our individuality? Like, how do we free ourselves from the group? So I'm going to suggest there's lots of ways, but I'm going to suggest 3 ways that we can do this. And the first thing we can do to help ourselves is firstly identify what groups we are part of. So as I said, some groups we've been born into. So our family, our nationality, our social class, our race, our gender, and lots of other things we've been born into. And all those groups will have certain ways of behaving and thinking that we've sort of taken on unconsciously, we've inherited. And then other groups will be ones we've elected to join, like Liverpool, Star Trek, etc. Also, our workplace, our political views, and everything like that we're part of. And in each case, the culture will be having an effect on us, either consciously or unconsciously. And certain of those groups will be having more of an effect on us than other groups, depending on what we identify. So the first step is we need to become aware that we have that conditioning in the first place, because otherwise we can't do anything about it unless we have an awareness that it's going on. So I've got another list here, which is ways that we can identify where we're being a bit groupy. And just to say as well, we're all being groupy all the time, so don't think, oh, I'm a terrible person and I'm, for being a groupy person. We're all doing this all the time, but it's just ways to spot particular areas where we might be particularly groupy. So the first one is if we we notice that there are certain groups where we really want to identify with that label of that group, or conversely, where we really want to reject that label of that group. So that could be any of our labels, gay, straight, guardian reader, gamer, white, working class, middle class, northerner, Sheffielder, climber, whatever, so we've got these labels, and some of them we really like for some reason, like we really want to hold on to them. I was thinking, I don't climb that much anymore, but I'm still quite attached to the label climber, and if I see people who climb, I feel really bonded and warm and fuzzy for no particular reason other than that I know they go climbing. But if we tend towards individualism, we'll be more focused on what groups we don't belong to, and we'll really not want to have labels. And I was thinking, one of my few examples of this is maybe I really, for some reason, resist the label meditator. And even though I meditate every day, There's something about that label that I really dislike, and I'm very clear that I'm not a meditator. I don't know why. So I won't go to things that meditators go to. So it's very crazy. So anyway, yes. So yes. So how we identify, that's important to notice that, like where we really move towards or away from labels. Secondly, we can really notice what our views are like and whether they tend to conform with the views of the group or whether they tend to oppose them. And it's possible to have the same group, the same view or oppose a view of a group without it being groupie behaviour. It might be individual behaviour, but we can be honest with ourselves about what's going on there. So my example was, I was thinking of, I'm English. English people really like to queue. Have you noticed that? Sometimes I notice there's a bus stop and there are 2 people at the bus stop and the bus is empty, and yet they still need to get on in the same order that they stood there. And it's so sweet. It's so sweet. I'm very English in that way. I like queuing. I've really taken on that conditioning. So when I'm in places where there's substandard queuing, I get very, very huffy indeed. Very huffy indeed. So that's just my group conditioning. Like, I think queues are good. Why? Because I'm English. So, yeah. On the other hand, we might automatically disagree with a response of a group. We see a group having a particular view, and because we don't think very much of that group, we automatically think that view's rubbish, and we've got no time for it. Again, hard for me to find examples of individualism in my case, but I was thinking of when Harry Potter came out, I was very, very like, oh, everyone else likes it, it must be rubbish. So I completely refused to have anything to do with it for about 7 or 8 years, at which point I realised it was like my favourite thing ever. So I think I missed out. You missed out on a lot by having that sort of response. So it's almost like because the group thought it was good, I thought it was rubbish. So yeah. My response was still being dictated by the group. So that's the second thing to notice. The third thing to notice is whether we're seeking a particular group's approval or disapproval. I mean, some of us might have more of a tendency towards this anyway, but we can watch where that goes on particularly. And it won't be every group necessarily, but it'll be certain groups particularly. So maybe our family or our friends or our workplace or maybe even here. So you notice that you want to be a particular person in those places because you want those people to like you, or you don't care if they like you. So one of the other responses. And so we might feel restricted from being honest or being ourselves. And I've noticed I sometimes get this when I'm with somebody who I really like and they say, I can't think of an exact, they say something like, oh, well, you know about blah, blah. And I think, oh, yeah. And I say, yeah, I do, even though I don't, because I think I don't want to look stupid, because I want them to like me, which is really, well, it's not honest. So my kind of desire to be an honest kind of person with integrity goes right out the window because of my desire to be approved of by this person, this group. So, yeah. And, we might have the sense that we're one person somewhere, we're a different person somewhere else with different people. Or we might notice if we have the opposite tendency, if we tend to crave disapproval and rebellion, we might notice, our approval might still be dictated to by the group, but rather than wanting their approval, we'll want their disapproval. So we might feel that to act in a way that this group, if they approved of us, it would almost be like a criticism, because they've got such awful views that if they thought I was great, then that would be some sort of slur on me. So I need to do the opposite of everything that they stand for. So that would be the opposite. That would be an individualist thing. We sort of want to go into combat with that group. And any authority figure, actually, that we think of as representing that group. So we can sometimes be rebelling against perceived authority if we get into this sort of habit. So there's some clues for being groupie. So hopefully we identify our groups through the clues. And then the second thing we can do is we can start to challenge our group conditioning, because just being aware of it will be helpful, but the next thing to do is we need to challenge that. So how do we do that? Well, there's lots of ways we can do that. Any way, really, which helps us to move beyond an unconditional acceptance of these views as being true and the only truth, because we can tend to think that, can't we, about our views, is that they are just true, and anyone who has a different view, well, they're just wrong. And what we're trying to move towards is a situation where we're at least willing to accept that it's possible we might not be right. So that would be a good step forward. So that's what we're moving towards. We can start to understand that if we had been in somebody else's shoes, if we'd been conditioned differently, we might well have the same views as that person if we were in their group. And that's what we need to move towards. So we need to think of ways that we can try and start to put ourselves in other people's shoes. I mean, doing the metta bhavana is a really great way that we can start to put ourselves in other people's shoes, particularly people who we really don't agree with at all. We can put them in that stage, in the fourth stage, and we can really try and see things from their perspective. We can also deliberately take ourselves out of our own conditioning. We can start to go places which will challenge our conditioning. So travelling is a really great way to highlight our social conditioning and how attached we are to our ideas of what is right and proper. So when I went to India in 2011, I can say that really challenged my views about queuing, as well as all my other views about the right way to eat and sleep and social, personal space and noise levels which are acceptable and all those other things. Yeah, it didn't meet any of those. So really great for me to understand how relative my ideas about what is a correct way to live. And if we can't go to other places, we can certainly learn more about them. I mean, we've got unprecedented access to information about other cultures and ways of living. And that really helps us to understand the relativity of our own beliefs and our own views. And I was looking online at something that's always fascinated me, which is the women from Myanmar, the Kayan women, and they wear those, have you seen pictures of them? They wear these lots of rings around their necks, and what it does is it gives them the impression of having a very long neck. And that's got a lot to do with their ideas of beauty and social standing in their culture. And when I see that, I just think that's crazy, but for them, that's just completely normal and beautiful. And it really helps me to see that my own views about fashion and about beauty are just completely received from the culture that I'm part of, actually. Nothing at all to do with objective standards of beauty or fashion or anything. We can also reflect on our views historically and how quickly fashionable views change over time. And I was thinking in this respect about not that many decades ago, it would have been outrageous to suggest anything other than that the place for a woman is in the home, cooking and cleaning, looking after their husband and bringing up the children. That would have been just it. Now, if you were to suggest that, you'd probably be lynched. That is definitely no longer part of what's correct in our culture. But that's not very long, is it? That's maybe, 50 or 60 years ago, if that. So who's to say that in another few decades, our views about what's correct, again, might be completely changed. So we really can't think that our views about what's right and wrong and what our group tells us is true at all in any objective way. So it can be interesting to reflect on our views more objectively, to think more like, well, what would the Buddhist say? Actually, let's try and put our group conditioning aside and think about these things as objectively as we can. So we've got our tools, we've got metta, we've got mindfulness, and we've got our ethical precepts, and those are very good places to start, to try and start assessing groups' views about whether or not we think that they hold any weight, so that we stop just taking them on automatically. So that's the second one, challenging our group conditioning. You probably think in your groups there's lots of other ways you could go about trying to challenge your group conditioning. And it might depend a little bit on what the groups are, actually, so that might come out a bit more in your discussions. And the third and final thing I'd like to suggest is spending more time with spiritual friends and Sangha. And this is because we've seen how the nature of the group is to want to keep the group members the same. And that's just part of the group, really. And so one thing we can really do to help ourselves become individuals, to change and to grow, is to put ourselves in situations where we're going to be surrounded by people who are going to encourage us to change and grow, rather than those who are going to try and keep us the same. They want us to change and be different. And hopefully those people who want us to change and grow will be our spiritual friends and the Sangha, because we're all together here in the business of wanting to change and grow. That's sort of what brings us all. That's what we've all got in common. And so when we're all here, we can support each other to do that. But it's worth saying that just because we're a Sangha and a spiritual community, it doesn't mean that we're free from group behaviour. Because, we're still probably not all true individuals, and group behaviour is very natural to us. But Bhante Sangharachita has this term positive group. So we have some groups which are negative groups, but we have some groups which are more positive. And what a positive group is it's a group where hopefully some of the members of the group are closer to being true individuals. And that will have what he calls a refining influence on the group. So even though the nature of the group is still really to want to keep the group members the same, so that, we come here and we still recognise our friends and we can still talk about the same things, and we're not kind of walking into, otherwise that would be just really frightening, wouldn't it? If everyone was changing all the time so much we didn't recognise each other. We want each other to sort of be the same in a certain sort of a way. So even though I notice that I long to grow and change, and I want you all to want me to grow and change, I also notice that sometimes my friends in the Sangha, they grow and change a lot, and I think, I'm not sure I like that. And I sort of want them to be more the same, more how I know them. But because I've been exposed to that refining influence of my teachers, and people like Vedanya Surimati, who taught my intro course, people like Bhante Sangharachita, all of the writings, the team that I work with here, and the Buddha and all of the Buddha's writings, because I've been exposed to that for years and years. Usually, I can catch that kind of desire to squash and step back and delight in the growth of people. So I can see how being part of the spiritual community allows me to allow people to change. And it allows me to allow myself to change as well. And it allows other people to allow me to change. And so it's one of the ways that we can best encourage our individuality, I think, is to spend time with Sangha members, our friends, who are going to really allow our growth. And we can do that for them as well. So it's a gift we can give them back in return. And I think probably the biggest gift we can give anyone is to allow them to change. So and it is natural to want to be part of a group. So the very least we can do is try and find a positive group to be part of. But of course, at its very best, the Sangha isn't a group at all. So this is where we're really getting to. So hopefully, through this, we're all going to transform. We're all going to become more and more true individuals. And a Sangha at its best this is what a Sangha at its best is. It's a Sangha of beings who are true individuals, who are being themselves. They're not being pulled around by group instincts, but by their highest values. And they're being pulled along by that fragrance of the Buddha's influence, which I talked about earlier, and the teachings and his teachings. And this sort of collection of beings, this network of true individuals, this is Sangha in the truest sense of the word. And it's this sort of Sangha that is capable of containing bricks. It is this sort of Sangha that's capable of building the Buddha land. Thank you.